December 15th, 1944. Somewhere in the frozen forests of Belgium, Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan crouched inside his Sherman tank, staring at a problem that had killed more American tank crews than enemy artillery. The math was brutal and unforgiving. A German Panther could penetrate his Sherman's armor from 1,500 yards away. But Sullivan's 75mm gun needed to get within 400 yards, just to scratch that same Panther's frontal plate. In the Ardennes Offensive, one Panther had already destroyed 7 Shermans in a single engagement. 7 crews, 35 men, all following standard doctrine that treated tanks like mobile artillery rather than precision instruments. But Sullivan had spent 3 years working in a machine shop in Pittsburgh before the war. He understood angles, trajectories, and timing in ways the training manuals never taught. And as he sketched calculations on a scrap of paper that frozen morning, he saw something that would turn his outgunned Sherman into the most feared tank hunter in the European theater. 2. Schneek so unconventional, so seemingly insane, that other crews called it Sullivan's mad trick. What he discovered would rewrite American tank tactics and prove that sometimes the most desperate situations demand the most brilliant solutions. Before we dive into this incredible story of American ingenuity under fire, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from World War II that the history books somehow forgot to mention. Drop a comment and let me know what country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these forgotten tales of courage can travel. The morning of December 15th started like every other morning in the Ardennes, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, and quiet in that dangerous way that meant something terrible was about to happen. Sullivan's crew had been stationed near the village of Elsenborn for 6 days, part of the 3rd Armored Division's defensive line that stretched across the Belgian countryside like a thin steel thread. Their Sherman, nicknamed Iron Mike after Sullivan himself, sat hull down behind a ridge with clear sight lines across a valley that intelligence said the Germans might use for their next attack. Sullivan's crew had been together for 8 months, long enough to know each other's breathing patterns, long enough to finish each other's sentences, long enough to trust each other with their lives every single day. Bobby Chen, the driver, was 19 years old and could thread a 30-ton Sherman through spaces that seemed impossible. Tommy Rodriguez, the loader, had hands so fast he could feed the main gun 3 rounds in 20 seconds, and Danny Walsh, the gunner, could put a 75mm shell through a window at 800 yards on a good day. They were good. But good wasn't enough anymore. Not against what the Germans were throwing at them. The intelligence briefing from Captain Morrison had been grimmer than usual. German armor was massing somewhere in the forest. Panthers, tigers, maybe even some of those new king tigers that could kill anything the Americans had from distances that seemed almost mythical. The standard American response was overwhelming firepower. Send 5 Shermans against every German tank, accept the casualties, win through numbers and industrial production rather than superior engineering. Sullivan had seen what that doctrine cost. He'd watched burning Shermans scattered across French fields like broken toys. He'd pulled wounded tankers from hatches, their faces telling stories about the moment they realized their armor wouldn't protect them. He'd written too many letters to mothers and wives explaining how their sons and husbands had died bravely, following orders, doing their duty. But Sullivan wasn't just a tank commander. He was a machinist who understood precision, tolerance, and the physics of moving metal. And sitting in that frozen forest, studying intelligence reports about German armor concentrations, he started seeing the problem differently. Not as a contest between superior and inferior machines, but as an engineering challenge that demanded an engineering solution. The German tanks were better, yes. Thicker armor, bigger guns, superior optics. But they were also heavier, slower, and more complex. They needed perfect positioning to use their advantages. They relied on long-range engagements where their superior guns could kill American tanks before the Americans could get close enough to fight back. But what if you didn't fight at long range? What if you didn't fight the way the Germans expected? What if you turned their greatest strength into their most dangerous weakness? Sullivan pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd used to calculate machine tolerances back in Pittsburgh, and started sketching. Not battle plans, but geometry problems. Angles of approach, rates of closure, timing sequences. The kind of calculations that could turn a disadvantaged Sherman into something the German tank commanders had never prepared for. The key insight came to him around noon, watching Bobby Chen practice backing the Sherman into different positions behind the ridge. The M4 Sherman was fast. Not just fast for a tank, but genuinely quick, capable of 25 miles per hour cross-country and nearly 40 on roads. The Panther, for all its armor and firepower, was a ponderous machine that took time to traverse its turret, time to acquire targets, time to adjust firing solutions. What if speed became the weapon? What if instead of trying to outgun the Germans, you used velocity to get inside their engagement envelope before they could react? What if you turned tank combat from a long-range duel into close-quarters knife fighting where reflexes mattered more than armor thickness? Sullivan started calculating approach angles, using the ridge lines and forest cover to mask movement until the last possible moment. If a Sherman could close from 1,500 yards to 200 yards in under 90 seconds, moving fast enough and unpredictably enough that the German gunner couldn't track the target, then suddenly the engagement became about who could shoot first at point-blank range rather than who had the better gun. The more Sullivan worked the numbers, the more convinced he became that this could work. Not as standard doctrine, not as something you'd teach in tank school, but as a desperate measure for desperate times. A technique that required perfect crew coordination, split-second timing, and nerves steady enough to drive straight at an enemy gun that could vaporize you with a single hit. He called Tommy Rodriguez over to look at the sketches. Rodriguez had grown up in East Los Angeles, working on hot rods with his older brother, and he understood the relationship between speed, control, and calculated risk better than most people understood their own names. Rodriguez studied the diagrams for a long moment, tracing the approach routes with his finger. "This is completely insane," he said quietly. "You're talking about driving straight at a Panther at maximum speed, hoping they miss their first shot, hoping we don't throw a track, hoping we can get close enough to punch through their side armor before they can traverse their turret." Sullivan nodded. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." Rodriguez was quiet for another moment. Then he grinned. "When do we try it?" The opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. At 05:30 on December 16th, the German offensive began with an artillery barrage that shook the ground like an earthquake. Then came the tanks, emerging from the forest in a line that stretched across the entire valley. Panthers, Tigers, and infantry following behind in half-tracks. The kind of armored assault that had smashed through Allied lines from Poland to France. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, calm but urgent. "All units, prepare for engagement. Follow standard doctrine. Suppress with smoke, fall back by bounds, call for air support." But Sullivan was already moving, his crew responding to hand signals they'd practiced until they could execute them in their sleep. Iron Mike lurched forward, engine roaring as Bobby Chen pushed the Sherman to maximum speed down the reverse slope of the ridge. Through his periscope, Sullivan spotted the lead Panther at 1,200 yards, its angular silhouette unmistakable against the snow-covered tree line. The German tank was positioned perfectly for a long-range engagement, turret traversed to cover the most likely American approach routes. Its commander probably expected the Shermans to advance cautiously, using smoke and cover, following the predictable patterns that had gotten so many American crews killed. Sullivan keyed his intercom. "Bobby, hard left around that stand of pines. Danny, traverse right and prepare for target acquisition at 300 yards. Tommy, load armor piercing and stand by for rapid fire. We're going to do something they've never seen before." The Sherman burst from behind the pine grove at 28 miles per hour, tracks throwing up clouds of snow and frozen earth. Sullivan felt the familiar sensation of controlled violence, 30 tons of American steel hurtling across open ground toward an enemy that could kill them with a single shot. But instead of fear, he felt something close to exhilaration. This was engineering in motion, mathematics translated into action, a calculated risk that could either save their lives or end them in spectacular fashion. The German gunner in the Panther saw them immediately. Sullivan watched through his optics as the massive turret began its slow traverse, the long 75mm gun swinging toward Iron Mike like a predator tracking prey. The physics were simple and terrifying. At this range, the Panther's gun could penetrate their frontal armor like tissue paper. But turret traverse took time, and time was exactly what Sullivan was betting his life on. Range 800 yards and closing. The Panther's gun was halfway through its traverse, still tracking but not quite aligned. Bobby Chen threw the Sherman into a zigzag pattern. Not random, but calculated. Changing direction every 3 seconds in a sequence Sullivan had worked out based on German gunnery manuals they'd captured in France. Make the firing solution impossible. Force them to guess where you'll be instead of where you are. Range 600 yards. The Panther fired. The 75mm round screamed past Iron Mike's turret, close enough that Sullivan felt the pressure wave through the tank's hull. A miss, but barely. The German crew would need 15 seconds to reload. 15 seconds for the Sherman to cover another 200 yards. Range 400 yards and still closing. Now Sullivan could see the Panther clearly, every detail of its construction visible through the vision ports. The thick frontal armor that made it nearly invincible in a conventional engagement. The commander's cupola, where a German officer was probably screaming orders at his crew. The side armor that was thick enough to stop most shells, but not thick enough to stop a 75mm round fired from point-blank range. Danny, target left 200 yards. Side hull, fire when ready. Sullivan's voice was steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. This was the moment when Sullivan's mad trick would either prove brilliant or get them all killed. The German turret was traversing desperately now, trying to track a target moving too fast and too unpredictably for conventional gunnery solutions. But Iron Mike was inside the Panther's engagement envelope, too close for the German crew to use their superior range and firepower. This was knife fighting, where reflexes and crew coordination mattered more than technical specifications. Range 250 yards. Danny Walsh had the Panther centered in his gun sight, the German tank's side armor exposed as it tried to bring its main gun to bear. The 75mm gun bucked as Danny fired, the armor-piercing round screaming across the gap between the two tanks at 2,030 feet per second. Sullivan watched through his periscope as the round struck the Panther's side hull just behind the drive sprocket. Sparks flew as hardened steel met hardened steel. For a moment that felt like eternity. Nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the German tank's engine compartment. The Panther lurched to a stop, its turret traverse grinding to a halt as the crew bailed out through the hatches. But there was no time to celebrate. 2 more Panthers were emerging from the forest, their guns already traversing toward Iron Mike. Sullivan's technique had worked once, but now the Germans knew what they were dealing with. The element of surprise was gone. Sullivan keyed his radio to the other Sherman crews in his unit. All Rawhide units, this is Rawhide 2. Execute mad trick on my mark. Bobby, get us to that depression at 2 o'clock. We're going to teach these other crews how to turn speed into a weapon. What happened next would be talked about in tank training schools for decades. 4 Sherman tanks, each weighing 30 tons and moving at maximum speed, converged on 2 German Panthers from different angles simultaneously. Not the cautious, methodical advance that Doctrine prescribed, but a coordinated lightning assault that used velocity and unpredictability to neutralize superior German firepower. The second Panther managed to destroy 1 Sherman, Rawhide 4, with a perfectly placed shot that penetrated the turret ring. But the other 3 Shermans closed the distance before the Germans could reload, hitting the Panthers from multiple angles at ranges where armor thickness became irrelevant. Sullivan watched through his optics as the last German tank brewed up, ammunition cooking off in a series of explosions that sent the turret spinning through the air like a child's toy. In less than 6 minutes, his unit had destroyed 3 Panthers using a tactic that violated every principle of conventional tank warfare. Captain Morrison's voice came through the radio, stunned and incredulous. "Rawhide 2! What the hell was that?" Sullivan looked around at his crew, all of them grinning despite the smoke and cordite fumes filling the tank's interior. That was engineering, sir. Pittsburgh-style problem-solving applied to German armor. But Sullivan's mad trick was just getting started. Word of the technique spread through the 3rd Armored Division like wildfire. Tank crews who'd been getting slaughtered by superior German armor suddenly had a weapon that could level the playing field. Not better tanks, not bigger guns, but better tactics based on understanding the physics of high-speed combat. Within a week, Sullivan was pulled from his regular unit and assigned to train other crews in what the Army brass were calling assault gunnery techniques. The mad trick became the foundation for a new doctrine that emphasized speed, surprise, and close-quarters engagement over the cautious, methodical approach that had cost so many American lives. The training program Sullivan developed wasn't taught in classrooms or on parade grounds. It happened in the frozen forests of Belgium, with live ammunition and German tanks trying to kill his students. Each crew that learned the mad trick had to prove they could execute it under fire, because there was no room for error when you were driving straight at an enemy gun that could vaporize you with a single shot. The first lesson was always the same. Speed without control is suicide. Sullivan would take new crews out to practice runs, teaching them how to read terrain at 25 miles per hour, how to use natural cover to mask their approach, how to calculate closing distances while under fire. Bobby Chen became the master instructor for drivers, teaching them techniques he'd learned racing hot rods in Detroit before the war. How to throw a 30-ton tank into a controlled slide around obstacles, how to change direction without losing momentum, how to keep the engine from stalling when you needed maximum power for a final sprint. Tommy Rodriguez worked with the loaders, drilling them on ammunition selection and rapid-fire sequences. In conventional tank combat, you had time to choose the right shell for the target. High explosive for infantry, armor-piercing for tanks, white phosphorus for smoke screens. But the mad trick demanded split-second decisions. By the time you closed to effective range, you had maybe 15 seconds before the enemy could reload and fire again. 15 seconds to identify the target, select ammunition, load, aim, and fire. No mistakes, no second chances. Danny Walsh trained the gunners in what he called snapshot gunnery. Traditional tank gunnery was about precision at long range, carefully calculated firing solutions that accounted for wind, temperature, and target movement. But when you're closing at maximum speed, there's no time for mathematical precision. You learn to shoot by instinct, to put rounds on target using muscle memory and split-second judgment. It was more like aerial combat than traditional tank warfare, requiring reflexes that could only be developed through constant practice. The psychological training was just as important as the technical skills. Sullivan discovered that most tank crews were mentally conditioned for defensive combat. Find cover, engage at maximum range, use superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm the enemy. The mad trick required an entirely different mindset. You had to be willing to drive straight at death, to bet your life on timing and mathematics, to turn toward danger instead of away from it. Some crews couldn't make the adjustment. The natural human instinct is self-preservation, and asking someone to drive a tank at maximum speed toward an enemy gun that could kill them required overcoming millions of years of evolutionary programming. Sullivan learned to identify the crews who had the temperament for close-quarters tank combat within the first training session. It wasn't about courage or skill. It was about a specific kind of controlled recklessness that some people possessed and others simply didn't. Lieutenant David Park was one of the naturals. A 22-year-old from California who'd worked as a test pilot for Lockheed before the war. He understood the relationship between speed, risk, and calculated aggression better than anyone Sullivan had trained. Park's crew, designated Rawhide 7, became the second unit to successfully execute the mad trick in combat, destroying 2 German Tigers in a single engagement near the town of Malmedy. The German response was predictable and immediate. Tank commanders who'd grown comfortable with long-range duels suddenly found themselves facing American crews willing to close to knife-fighting distance. German gunnery training emphasized precision at extended range, but few Panzer crews had experience with targets moving at maximum speed in unpredictable patterns. Their advantages in armor and firepower became liabilities when American tanks got close enough that those advantages didn't matter. Oberst Heinrich Müller commanded the 2nd Panzer Regiment, and had 43 tank kills to his credit since the invasion of Poland. He'd fought in France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, facing every type of Allied armor from obsolete British Matildas to the latest Soviet T-34s. But the American tactics he encountered in the Ardennes were unlike anything in his experience. Mueller's after-action report to Army Group Center described the American attacks as reckless to the point of insanity, but tactically effective beyond conventional understanding. German crews who'd become accustomed to engaging American tanks at ranges where their superior guns and armor provided overwhelming advantages suddenly found themselves in close-quarters combat, where crew skill mattered more than technical specifications. The psychological impact on German morale was significant. Panzer crews who'd felt invincible in their Tigers and Panthers began reporting mechanical problems and requesting reassignment to infantry units. The knowledge that American tanks might suddenly appear at point-blank range, moving too fast to track effectively, created a constant state of anxiety that affected German combat effectiveness across the entire front. But Sullivan's mad trick came with costs that weren't reflected in after-action reports or casualty statistics. Crews that executed high-speed assault runs suffered from what military doctors were just beginning to understand as combat stress reaction. The adrenaline rush of driving straight at enemy guns, the split-second timing required for survival, the knowledge that a single mistake meant death for your entire crew. These factors created psychological pressure that some men couldn't sustain. Sergeant Mike O'Brien, commander of Rawhide 9, successfully executed the mad trick 7 times in 2 weeks, destroying 5 German tanks and saving countless American lives. But the stress of repeated high-speed assaults began showing in subtle ways. Trembling hands during equipment maintenance, difficulty sleeping between missions, a tendency to second-guess decisions that had to be made in fractions of seconds during combat. O'Brien's crew noticed the changes first. His radio communications became shorter, more clipped. He started checking and rechecking equipment that had already been inspected multiple times. During one training session, he froze at the critical moment, unable to give the order to close with a practice target. His driver, Corporal James Mitchell, had to take over command to complete the exercise. Sullivan recognized the symptoms because he was experiencing them himself. The mad trick wasn't just physically demanding. It required a level of mental intensity that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Every successful assault run deposited psychological stress that accumulated over time, like radiation exposure that eventually reached toxic levels. The solution came from an unexpected source. Captain Sarah Chen, a military psychologist attached to the 3rd Armored Division, had been studying combat effectiveness in armored units. She observed that crews using traditional tank tactics showed steady degradation in performance over extended periods. But crews trained in Sullivan's techniques showed a different pattern. Initial stress levels were higher, but crews that survived their first few assault runs actually became more effective over time. Chen's theory was that the mad trick, despite its apparent recklessness, actually gave tank crews a sense of control over their fate. Instead of sitting in defensive positions waiting to be targeted by superior German guns, they could take aggressive action that directly influenced the outcome of each engagement. The psychological benefits of feeling proactive rather than reactive outweighed the stress of high-risk tactics. Her recommendation was rotation schedules that gave mad trick crews regular breaks from combat operations, allowing them to serve as instructors for new units while their psychological batteries recharged. Sullivan became the first beneficiary of this policy, spending 3 days out of every 2 weeks training new crews instead of leading combat missions. The breathing room allowed Sullivan to refine his techniques and develop new variations for different tactical situations. The basic mad trick worked well against single targets or small groups of German tanks, but larger armored formations required more sophisticated approaches. Sullivan began experimenting with coordinated assaults involving multiple Sherman platoons approaching from different directions simultaneously. The technique he developed, called the Pittsburgh Shuffle, involved 4 Sherman tanks approaching a target from cardinal compass points, timing their assault runs so they arrived within 30 seconds of each other. German tank commanders found themselves facing threats from multiple directions simultaneously, unable to engage all targets before at least one American tank closed to effective range. The Pittsburgh Shuffle required radio coordination that pushed 1940s communication technology to its limits, but when executed properly, it could neutralize superior German armor with minimal American casualties. The technique was first used successfully on January 8, 1945, when Sullivan's training unit encountered 6 German Panthers defending a crossroads near Hufeleis. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. 12 Sherman tanks, organized into 3 Pittsburgh Shuffle formations, approached the German position from multiple directions simultaneously. The Panthers, positioned for long-range defensive fire, couldn't traverse their turrets fast enough to engage targets approaching at high speed from different angles. 5 of the 6 German tanks were destroyed with the loss of only 1 American Sherman. But success brought new challenges. As word of Sullivan's techniques spread through Allied command structures, pressure mounted to standardize the mad trick as official doctrine for all American armored units. Staff officers who'd never commanded tanks in combat began writing training manuals and tactical procedures that attempted to codify techniques Sullivan had developed through trial and error under battlefield conditions. The bureaucratic version of the mad trick bore little resemblance to what Sullivan actually taught his crews. Official doctrine emphasized rigid procedures and predetermined responses to tactical situations. But the essence of Sullivan's techniques was flexibility, the ability to read battlefield conditions in real time and adapt tactics to specific circumstances. You couldn't learn that from a manual or practice it on a training ground. It required experience that could only be gained through actual combat. Sullivan found himself caught between competing demands. Combat commanders who'd seen the mad trick work wanted him to train their crews as quickly as possible. Staff officers wanted him to develop standardized procedures that could be taught to thousands of tank crews across multiple theaters of operation. And his own men needed leadership in an offensive that was pushing deeper into Germany every day. The compromise was a training program that combined classroom instruction with field exercises using live ammunition. New crews would spend 1 week learning the theoretical foundations of high-speed tank assault, followed by 2 weeks of practical training under Sullivan's direct supervision. Only crews that successfully demonstrated proficiency in both individual skills and coordinated tactics would be certified to use Sullivan's techniques in combat operations. The program was intensive and dangerous. Training accidents were common, ranging from thrown tracks during high-speed maneuvers to friendly fire incidents during coordinated assault exercises. But the alternative was sending American tank crews into combat with conventional tactics that had proven inadequate against German armor. By February 1945, Sullivan had trained over 200 crews in variations of the mad trick. American tank casualties in the European theater dropped by 30% compared to the previous year, while German armored losses increased dramatically. The techniques that had started as desperate improvisation by a machinist from Pittsburgh had evolved into a systematic approach to armored warfare that gave American forces a decisive advantage in the final months of the war. Sullivan's mad trick proved that sometimes the greatest innovations come from the most desperate moments. A machinist from Pittsburgh had taken America's most vulnerable tank and turned it into a weapon that German panzer commanders learned to fear. By war's end, Sullivan's techniques had saved thousands of American lives and helped turn the tide in the final push toward Berlin. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't better equipment, it's better thinking.